back and listen to again. But yeah, we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to kick off this webinar series with today's webinar. And we just thought, what better way to take advantage of this new virtual landscape that we are all in than to utilize these resources to be able to share information and expand our reach and be able to just really share resources and learn from other members of our community. So thank you so much for joining us. We are really looking forward to this. We hope that we can just spread some more varied information and sort of deepen our understanding of different topics within the disability inclusion space outside of what our community might find through attending our events or having one buddy in Best Buddies. We're hoping to just get a lot of different voices sharing about these different topics. So we do want to note that these webinars are solely for the purpose of sharing information and resources and hearing from members of our community and people outside of our community who are experts in different topics. So our guests do not speak on behalf of Best Buddies, though we are so grateful to them for sharing their experiences and their knowledge with us. So we really hope that you'll take something valuable from this talk today as well. So some of you know us already and have worked with Best Buddies, but for those of you who are joining us through Bree or who heard about this webinar elsewhere, welcome. We'll give a quick overview of Best Buddies first before we get started. So Best Buddies is a global nonprofit organization that's dedicated to establishing a global volunteer movement that creates opportunities for one-to-one friendships, integrated employment, leadership development, and inclusive living for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which you'll hear us referring to as IDD throughout this presentation. That's what we're referring to as intellectual and developmental disabilities. So the IDD community that Best Buddies serves includes, but is not limited to, people with Down syndrome, autism, Fragile X, Williams syndrome, cerebral palsy, traumatic brain injuries, and other undiagnosed disabilities. So our goal is really to promote inclusion and create a more inclusive world for people with IDD by empowering them to know that they are valued and integral parts of their community. And we do this through our friendship, jobs, leadership, and living programs. Best Buddies has a global impact, so our programs are operating in 50 countries across 6 continents, and that includes 27 state offices here in the US. And just a little bit of extra background info on all of our programs before we dive a little bit into our jobs program specifically. Best Buddies started in our friendship programs back in 1989, and we have since grown to include 4 pillars, but the first one is friendship. So for many people with IDD, making connections can be a challenge, especially due to the history of social isolation of people with IDD. So that was the original goal of Best Buddies, was to provide friendship, social connection, and that remains a really valuable part of what we do today. We facilitate one-on-one buddy pairs in schools from elementary up to college and then beyond through our Citizens program and our eBuddies program, which is an online pen pal program for one-to-one friendships as well. And we have buddy pairs who have been matched for upwards of 30 years at this point, which is really awesome. Our next pillar, the bottom left, is leadership development. So that is our training program that assists Best Buddies ambassadors to gain the confidence and public speaking skills to advocate for themselves and others with IDD. Our ambassadors speak at all kinds of events. They do webinars like this with us and are really able to spread the word of inclusion in the community. So we love our ambassadors. Some of them are on this call with us today, actually. Our newest pillar, bottom right, is inclusive living. So our inclusive Best Buddies living residences allow people with and without IDD to live together in community. And the residents learn independent living skills, they develop relationships with their housemates, and these living spaces are centered around university campuses where the residents can utilize campus resources, seek employment, and just continue to learn, grow, and thrive. So our fourth pillar, integrated employment. Samantha's going to share a little bit more about that, but basically it is really integral to what we do here at Best Buddies, and both Samantha and I are on the jobs team in our LA office, and we source passionate and qualified talent and connect them with companies that are looking to hire a diverse and inclusive workforce. And this program really makes it possible for job seekers to become independent members of the community, earn an income, pay taxes, support themselves, save for the future, and just have that social aspect as well of working with coworkers out in the community. So Samantha will share a little bit more about that and about what makes our program so special, and then how it relates to what we're here to talk about today. Thank you, Laura. So first and foremost, I just want to throw this statistic out there. An estimated 81% of adults with IDD do not have a paid job in the community. So that is a really alarming and sad statistic, and we strive at Best Buddies to change that every day by assisting our participants find that meaningful and gainful employment in their communities that Laura was referring to. So what's even more unfortunate as well is that with this new reality that we're living in, the unemployment rates have now obviously spiked for people with and without IDD. So although our jobs program was hit very hard with countless amounts of participants being laid off or furloughed due to COVID, over the past 6 months, we've really pivoted to providing services almost entirely virtually and have found quite a few silver linings because of it. Next slide, please. So we are not able to do what we do without the support of our employer partners. So as you can see here on the screen, this is a snapshot of some of the national and local employer partners that we work with. A national partner is a company who has formed a partnership with Best Buddies and agreed to hire a certain amount of our jobs participants across the country. So for example, we have Mod Pizza on here, shout out Mod, they're amazing, and TJX company who has signed on to hire a bunch of our jobs participants over a span of time. So we're so grateful to work with these companies and the countless others that employ people with IDD. And we are constantly adding to this list. Every single one of you, I kind of want to do a little call to action, is able to help a Best Buddies jobs participant find a job by starting to think about your connections. So, you know, where do your parents work, or your siblings or spouses or aunts and uncles? You know, where do you go to get your haircut, your dentist, your grocery store? You know, now knowing a bit about what Laura has shared and what I have spoken about, you have the knowledge necessary to pitch the Best Buddies Jobs program to all of these aforementioned professionals in your life. And the Best Buddies staff is here, you know, in different parts of California and around the country to assist you, you know, if you feel strongly about presenting this program to a business. So I'll drop my email in the chat for anyone that's interested in learning more about how to take action in this regard. Next slide, please. So now the good stuff, right? So before introducing our guest speaker, I'd like to touch on one of the main ways that Best Buddies Jobs works with our participants and employer partners to ensure success for everyone. So if needed, we provide assistance with gaining reasonable accommodations on the work site. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, do a quick mute, there we go. The Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, is a civil rights law that was enacted in 1990 that prohibits discrimination based on disability. So within the ADA, the topic of reasonable accommodation is discussed. And a reasonable accommodation is any change to the hiring process, to the job description, to the way that the job is done, or the work environment that allows a person with a disability, you know, the potential to really perform those essential functions of the job and to enjoy that equal employment opportunity. So employers by law are required to follow these policies and regulations. And some examples of these accommodations could be the use of assistive technology in the workplace, like screen readers or dictation software, or more frequently scheduled breaks if necessary, or, you know, posted visual signs and automatic doors and ramps and modified workspaces.
and also service dog access. So even though honoring reasonable accommodation is an action required by law, the process is still so difficult a majority of the time for some reason. So Best Buddies Jobs specifically works with companies to job carve and create these accommodations when needed. And the reason why you're all here today is to learn more in depth about disability visibility. And when we say that, we're referencing to the breakdown of visible versus invisible disabilities. And as you can see listed here, we have them defined as visible disabilities as ones that can be seen by the naked eye, and invisible disabilities are ones that are not apparently obvious to the observer. So Best Buddies Job serves as a bridge to connect people with visible and invisible disabilities with jobs. And it's great, obviously, that organizations like us exist, but we are hoping to ignite some sort of aha moments in all of you today, especially those who work in HR, to kind of reassess the way and think about the way that you read resumes or host interviews or review applications, etc. You know, not only for the people that we work with, but the millions of others that are applying to jobs without assistance. So now the time has come for me to zip it and pass it off to our guest speaker. So today we are so lucky to have the time to hear from Bree Harris. She is a recent graduate of Hampshire College, who is also an invisible disabilities activist and service dog advocate. So Bree will be sharing with us today about some of the basics about her own experience with her psychiatric and medical alert service dog, Arrow, and also some of the basics about disability visibility and her advocacy work. So welcome, Bree.
Hi. Thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to share, more about invisible disabilities and service dogs. As Samantha mentioned, I just graduated from Hampshire College with Arrow, my service dog. And in college, my primary focus was invisible disabilities, disability justice, as well as service dog law and policy. So to start off, I would just like to talk a little bit about why discussions on disability are so important. A lot of people don't know, but individuals with disabilities is the largest marginalized group in our entire country. The CDC has reported that 1 in 4 adults live with a disability. That's 61 million individuals. And out of that study, they actually only measured 6 different types of disabilities. So likely there is a lot more than that. And it is also the only group of marginalized individuals that anybody at any point could be a part of within an instant, with an accident or a condition that is diagnosed later on in life. So it's something that really is so hugely important in our society and should be talked about on a wider range. In addition to that, the largest percentage of individuals with disabilities in the disability community are those with invisible disabilities. And as Samantha mentioned, invisible disabilities are disabilities that aren't entirely obvious or have visual cues. They're typically hidden conditions, disorders, or illnesses. So just checking on my notes, making sure I'm not missing anything. Some examples of that of invisible disabilities are diabetes, epilepsy, PTSD, anxiety disorders, depression, MS, asthma, chronic pain, impaired hearing and vision. Those are just a few examples, but there are many, many more. Like I mentioned, largest group of individuals with disabilities have invisible disabilities. A lot of people with invisible disabilities are often accused of faking their disability. And this is a huge, huge issue within our society in terms of how we stigmatized who is disabled enough to qualify for certain accommodations or support or help in general. So it's very difficult for individuals with disabilities to be recognized, to get those accommodations, because we have, as a society, been taught that a disability should look like X, Y, and Z, and it doesn't look like, you know, someone that looks like me necessarily. So it's definitely a challenge and something to be considering and talking about. I also wanted to bring up how, you know, along with that how our society, along with how our society is defined, who is disabled or disabled enough, therefore worthy of accommodations, is because our social structures are systemically designed, or systemically not designed for individuals with disabilities, which enforces and normalizes ableism, which, for those that don't know, ableism is discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities. It also means having favor of able-bodied or minded individuals, which obviously is very problematic. And with that being said, in addition to how difficult it is for individuals with disabilities in general, but especially invisible disabilities, to get accommodations, one of those accommodations, like Samantha mentioned, is service dogs, which we can kind of transition to. Okay, what is a service dog? So to start off, as also Samantha mentioned, the Americans with Disability Act, also referenced as the ADA, is who defines what a service dog is, and anything in relation to service dogs, their laws, the regulations, the policies are all defined by the ADA legally. Anywhere or anyone that says anything different from the ADA is not a credible, it's not legal, legally accurate information. So that's something really important to note, because there's a lot of extremely misleading information out there. So the ADA defines service animals as dogs that are individually trained to do work or perform tasks for people with disabilities. So service dog is a very broadened umbrella term, sorry, for essentially assistance dogs. So there could be medical alert dogs, there could be guide dogs for the blind, there could be psychiatric service dogs. Those are all service dogs. They're all just a kind of service dog based off of the job they have been trained to do for their person. So you can move on to the next slide. So I want to go into a little more about service dogs, but there's so much. I think that's why my brain is so jumbled right now. But to go into some of it, I want to introduce a few common terms used around service dogs. So service dogs are legally considered as medical equipment, and I know that sounds really funny because they're living beings, which calling them medical equipment isn't to make them less of living beings. They are still considered living beings. However, legally, they need to be recognized from the perspective of the general public as medical equipment, much like a wheelchair or any other type of tool that might be used for an individual with a disability. So with that being said, let's go with first word, tasking. A task is defined as an action that the dog is trained to do that assists or mitigates the handler's disability. So the task must be directly related to the handler's disability. It can't be, you know, just something cool or fun. Otherwise, that's considered a trick. Much like, you know, you teach your dog to roll over. It's not a task. Let's see what's next. Team. So I'm actually going to go over handler first. A handler is the person that owns the dog. It's the person that the dog assists, that handles the dog, and service dogs only assist one individual, unlike therapy dogs, which assist multiple people. A lot of people get confused with all the different kinds of working dogs, but it's extremely important to know that those differences. A therapy dog, like I said, goes into places like airports or hospitals, and they are trained to, be in those environments and assist people that might have trauma or could use, some support and relieving stress and that sort of thing. So they're meant to be pet. They're meant to interact with multiple people with a lot of different scenarios, where a service dog is similarly, but only for one person that has a very specific job to a very specific disability that's very, individualized. So I went over handler. Team describes the handler and the dog as a unit. So legally, a service dog is considered, like I mentioned, a wheelchair. So it's an extension of your person. So my service dog, when I go into a place, she's an extension of me. Therefore, anywhere I can legally go, she, majority of the time, is legally allowed to go as well. So when someone says, or if I say a team, a service dog team, that's referencing the handler and the service dog as one. What's the next one? On and off duty. So a common misconception about service dogs is that they are always working, which in some perspective they are, because a service dog is essentially with their handler majority of the time, and assists their handler both in public and within their home. But I wanted to kind of highlight on and off duty because, at least for me, in terms of how I, as a handler, have worked with Arrow has on-duty time and off-duty time. And that's more of a behavioral thing rather than a assistance thing. So right now I'm sitting here, talking, and Arrow is, I'll show you guys Arrow later. She's sitting right by me, and she's technically off duty. And I established this by her gear being off. So there's certain behavioral expectations when her gear is on versus when her gear is off. And when her gear is off, she will still assist me if I have a medical episode. But it's more, the gear establishes more of how she should behave. If that makes sense. So, and then public access. Public access is a term used for when and where a service dog has ability to go somewhere, like has access to that space. So it essentially means that a service dog is allowed to go in most places the general public is allowed to go, much like how I mentioned she's an extension of my person. However, public access is a very delicate and intricate thing. It's a legal right that's exclusive only to service dogs. Service dogs are the only animal that are allowed within public spaces despite pet policy, because they are not pets. They are working dogs, they are medical equipment by law. So a lot of places that have pet policies, unfortunately, do allow or kind of like slide in, pets or people kind of sneak in pets or other kinds of animals. And unfortunately, by law, they're technically not allowed to do that. They're just not really aware of that. And from a handler perspective, it's taking advantage of my right, which is to have public access to my medical equipment in this space. So that's something that is important to consider. Another thing to do with public access, a lot of people think that a service dog is required to have registration, certification, or some sort of official document, a doctor's note, or an ID, which is all fraudulent. And I understand it kind of, for those that didn't know, it's kind of surprising, because you'd think that there would be some sort of identification or regulation or something, but the ADA makes it this way so that it's more accessible to more individuals. There are a lot of places that, sell these ID cards, these registrations, you know, pay $70 and we'll send you your dog's ID card and a vest, and it's a service dog, which are obviously, like I mentioned, fraudulent. And in many states, depending on the state, have different, you know, laws on how they handle service dog fraud. But I know at least I'm in California. In California, there's there's jail time and up to $1,000 fine for service dog fraud. So it's very serious. So oftentimes, if someone, you know, tries to say they have a service dog and they show you their ID card, unfortunately, majority of the time it's fraudulent. So, and legally doesn't mean anything. So it's important to consider. Another thing with public access, a lot of times, for example, if I go into a place and obviously I have an invisible disability, and so a lot of places might not understand why I have a service dog, or think maybe I'm faking my service dog or a fraudulent service dog. So therefore, they might question me. So legally, there is a system to this, and it's that a business owner or staff can actually ask you two legal questions, can ask the handler of a service dog two legal questions in order to ensure proper access. And I wrote down those questions. So the first one, word for word from the ADA, is they may ask, is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And two, what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? Staff cannot ask about the person's disability, require medical documentation, require special identification card, training documentation, or require that the dog demonstrates its ability to do their task that they're trained to do. So that's really important to know. And sorry, I was just reading the chat. And then also, so program and owner trained. So another thing about dogs that a lot of people do not know is that a service dog can be program trained or it can be owner trained. It also could be partially both. A program trained service dog is a dog that goes through a training program, a program that specifically trains dogs to be service for the individual. And a lot of times they all have, you know, their own training systems and their own, you know, way of going about how they handle things. But a program trained service dog is just as legally eligible and considered as a legit service dog as an owner trained service dog. And an owner trained service dog is, in my case, I'm an owner trainer. I trained Arrow on my own to task and to be public access trained, meaning know how to behave in public and meet those behavioral requirements under the ADA to be then for in public. So a program trained dog, whether it comes, you know, from a credible program or someone that wants to go for it and try to train their own dog to be service, is just as credible as the other. And the reason why that this is the case, similarly to registrations, is that the ADA wanted it to be as accessible as possible. Unfortunately, program dogs can be up to like $30,000. And a lot of people don't have that money, especially people with disabilities. And so the ADA wanted to ensure that having a service dog and being able to get a service dog would be as accessible as possible. And so they made it where, you know, you can train your own dog and it can go places and assist you as long as it meets these requirements of being task trained. So doing some sort of action that assists and mitigates your disability directly, and then also meets public access requirements to get that right to that access. And backtracking a little bit, some of those public access like behavioral requirements include ensuring that the animal is in control at all times, under control at all times, that they are potty trained, that that they do not like pose a direct threat to like the general public, if they're not growling or like trying to bite people, like pretty standard stuff. And then like each handler and team has, you know, their own rules and regulations that they might add to public access. Like I personally encourage Arrow to not smell the ground, to not approach people, to keep a distance from people. So if we're walking by in a crowd, that she'll do her absolute best to not brush up against people, because, you know, people are fearful, people might be allergic to dogs, you never really know. And I want to our presence as a team to be as like least impactful in a negative way, or to interfere negatively with the general public. I want to leave, you know, a positive experience and represent service dogs in a positive light. So that's something that's really important to me, as well as not even just brushing up against people, but clothes even, you know, when we're shopping, or smelling produce, when we're grocery shopping, you know, we'll practice walking past, you know, the banana stand. She loves bananas, and she can't smell those bananas. So that's important. Yeah, so those are some key things. Another term, or kind of term on there, is ESA, also known as emotional support animals. Those are, I'm sure you all have heard of emotional support animals, also known as comfort animals. They are not service dogs, as many people may think they might be, or have often confused them to be. So service dog, or emotional support animals, are completely different. They have no public access, at least like service dogs, where emotional support animals have very limited access. They only have, they can only be in your place of housing, like they can live with you in your apartment despite pet policy, as well as go on an aircraft with you. But otherwise, they're not allowed in most places despite pet policy, like most people think they are. And a lot of that is because, one, they're not required to be not required to have that public access training, therefore they're not trained to know how to behave in public. And so that's a huge problematic issue. But then also, the ADA does not recognize companionship and comfort or emotional support as a task that makes a dog legally considered a service dog, where, you know, I guess I didn't really give many examples of what a task could look like, but a task could look like a dog that guides their handler that's blind, to ensure that they don't, you know, cross the street when it's dangerous, or run into certain obstacles, or they can alert to a epileptic seizure or something, like before it happens, or they could go and get help from somebody in an emergency situation. Those are just a few examples. But a task could be as varied as the individual's experience with their disability, which we all know that that is extremely varied and wide range. You know, someone with the same disability as me might experience their disability completely differently, and need, you know, different accommodations accordingly. So maybe they don't even need a service dog. Maybe they have the other tools that work better for them versus me that works better with having Arrow assist me. So those are some things to also think about and consider. Go to the next slide. Yeah. So, and I just wanted to go over a quick overview of, I know it's a kind of a lot of information, and but something that I like to tell people in terms of understanding what exactly a service dog is that there's three components that you need to understand that a service dog is above all else things. And that the first thing is the handler, it has a disability, number one. Number two, the dog is task trained related to the handler's disability. So they perform a task that assists or mitigates the handler's disability. And three, the dog is public access trained. If you have only two of those things out of the three, it's not legally a service dog. So the dog, you could have a disability and have a task trained dog, but if your dog is not public access trained, does not properly behave in public, it legally is not considered a service dog. And the same thing with, you can have a perfectly task trained dog and perfectly public access trained dog, but not actually have a disability. And that also does not make your dog legally a service dog, therefore legally able to go into places and perform as an actual service dog, if that makes sense. So it's very important to have those three things and that they work cohesively together. So here are some do's and don'ts for service dogs, and hopefully some of you looked over them a little bit already, but a do is to respect the team's space. So every team definitely has their own way of navigating the world. Similarly to how I've explained, I don't let Arrow smell the ground or smell produce. Those are kind of given obvious things I feel that a team should realistically do, but they're not ADA like specifically written out required. The dog can't smell the ground, the dog must heel. Those are not required things. But I think that respecting the team space, similarly, each team has their own preference on things. A lot of teams are okay with people asking if you can pet their dog, and some teams aren't. And I personally am okay with people, that come up and ask. And I appreciate when people ask. You can always ask. But don't take it personally. If someone says, I'm sorry, like, I'm not comfortable with that, it might be because their dog needs to be focusing on them in that moment, or they're tasking in that moment, and you might not realize it. Tasks aren't always necessarily an obvious thing, or might come across as something totally different. A dog might need to alert to something by jumping on that person and saying, hey, something's going on. And that might come across on an outside perspective as the dog's misbehaving, or as, the dog is just like a fake or being silly or not a real, so I could go and pet it and it's not that big of a deal, which isn't necessarily true. So that's something to think about. Of course, try to always give service dog team, some space. A lot of places aren't designed for service dogs. For dogs in general, the human world is not designed for dogs. So there's a lot of things that can be challenging, like fitting under certain restaurant tables or narrow spaces, uneven ground, escalators, all these small little details that you don't really even think about. Another thing with space is a lot of people will take photos of service dogs or people with their service dogs, and it's definitely something that can be really intrusive and make people very uncomfortable. So that's something to think about as well. But again, something that you'd be better off asking for first. So that's something to think about. And also, one last thing on respecting the team space. I like to tell people, in terms of when they ask, can I do this or that with a service dog, you should ask yourself, if you would do it to a wheelchair, would you do it to a service dog? And that's a great way to gauge how you respond and interact with a service dog. Making sure you're talking to the handler and not the dog, respecting that relationship between the handler and the dog. It's very important. So do proper research. So like I mentioned, ada.gov covers everything that you need to know realistically about service dogs, and is a really, really important resource, especially with all the misleading information out there. So definitely look into that. What else? Make sure businesses ask the appropriate questions, which I read earlier. And then realize that service dogs are still dogs. Yes, so this is huge. Just like I mentioned with on and off duty, at the end of the day, service dogs are dogs. And anyone that's been around dogs knows that dogs are pretty similar to humans emotionally in terms of, they have good days, they have bad days, they have off moments, and they're not perfect. And, as a handler, and I know many other handlers as well, we do everything we can to make sure our dog is as perfect as we can make them be. And in terms of behavior, but it's not, you never really know what's going on. You might be having an off day. I think the biggest thing to know is that if a dog starts misbehaving, to not automatically think, oh, that's a fake service dog, or oh, they shouldn't be here. but pay more attention to how the handler responds to that behavior. If the handler is laughing at it, letting the dog, steal food off of a restaurant table or something wild like that, versus, redirecting the dog's focus if they're barking, or, regaining that control instantly and correcting that behavior right away, that is a key sign that that person, likely their dog is very legit and they get right back into focus. Or in a lot of cases when Arrow was training, if I couldn't get full control over her, or she just kept slipping up over and over, I would leave, because then your right to public access is violated in that sense. So, and so you really should leave. In that case too, if a handler has a dog that's constantly misbehaving and constantly not able to regain that control, a business can legally ask that person to leave, and should ask that person to leave, because it affects everybody around. So that's something to consider. Don't judge a team by its appearance. Like I just mentioned before, jumping to conclusions on what a task might look like, or on certain behaviors, having on and off days. It's definitely very violating to ask what your disability is. I understand people are curious and might, question a lot of things. There's a lot of fraudulent service dogs, so it's easy to jump to conclusions. I jump to conclusions myself all the time, in terms of if a service dog is legit or not. And it's something that is important to challenge and consider, when you're thinking about if a service dog is legit or not. And if that person's eligible to have one. Like, the general public is legally not really in the place to judge that as much as a business is. Definitely do not bring your pets or comfort animals into not pet friendly places is super, super important. If out of anything, one of the most important. I like to describe people bringing their pets into non-pet friendly places similarly to a space. It instantly makes a space inaccessible for me in a lot of cases, because in more situations than not, if someone brings their pet into, say, Target, which a lot of people think is pet friendly, but is not, another person might, even if their dog's well behaved, another person might think person was able to do it, so I'm going to do it with my dog, and then so on and so on. And then there are a handful of pets that aren't well behaved. I can't tell you how many times Arrow and I have been lunged at. I've gotten very close to being bitten, and those things do take a toll mentally, even if they don't impact, actually get to us physically, which does happen as well, unfortunately. It really does take its toll, especially on a service dog's training. If it impacts them to such an extent that they are traumatized, like, that might make it where you might have to wash a dog, which is another service dog term. Washing a dog means retiring it, or taking it out of being able to work anymore. And that's a huge deal, because that is essentially stripping someone from their medical equipment altogether, which in a lot of cases, people cannot even go out without their medical equipment, without their service dog. So that's something extremely important to consider when people are thinking, well, my dog's well behaved and it's just a quick trip and it's not that big of a deal. I'm just going to bring, Fido to Target with me because I think it's cute, or I think it's fun, or I've seen other people do it. It really does leave a long-term impact. And it also has made it where access is much more difficult as well, because if someone misbehaving pet or a fake service dog that is acting a fool, and then a legit team comes, a few days later, they'll automatically be denied access because the store, the business is associating service dogs as something that is a negative thing versus what it really is for. So, and the last thing, do not register or label a pet or ESA as a service dog, as service dog fraud, which I definitely mentioned before, and mentioned how registrations IDs are fraudulent. So okay. Now I can be a little less jittery since I was so worried about getting it all in. But so last goal. So I was, in second grade, I was diagnosed with a specific learning disability, auditory comprehension disorder, ADD, and a couple of other disorders along with that. So all my life, I've been challenged and struggled with having a disability. But around 13, I started to get severe panic attacks and was diagnosed with panic disorder, severe panic disorder, and phobias. And a lot of people consider that as, a generalized anxiety, but it's a little bit a step further than that. Just it's a chemical misbalance in my brain where I'll get sent signals of panic without warning or without any rhyme or reason. And it can be, I've forgotten where I'm at, or I fall into the ground, and, just freaking out essentially. And it's really, really scary, especially as a teenager. But I, did a lot of work to get through grade school. And when I got into college, I was like, I made it. I did it, I can support myself. I don't need accommodations. I don't need to tell the school I have a disability or anything like that. Around that time, I also was diagnosed with chronic, and I don't know how to pronounce it, but it starts with an O. It's a type of migraine that makes your vision go out, where a majority of my vision will just kind of blur over and black out, as well as AFib, which is a heart condition, so irregular heartbeat. But still, I was like, oh, I don't like, those aren't going to stop me from, going to class and being successful in college. Sure enough, after my first year, I failed a class and was asked to take time off from college, and I was devastated and ended up having to drop out of college. And during that time off, what should have been a semester ended up turning to a year and a half of time off. And I just was devastated, and I knew that I came to the realization that I needed extra help, and that it was okay, that this was always going to be an aspect of my life and a part of who I am, and that's not a negative thing, but that it's a beautiful thing and a part of who I am. So I started to do, more research on, okay, well, what sort of support could I really benefit from and be successful with? And in that process, I learned about service dogs, and I've always been very close with animals, and I felt, the impact that an animal can have when it's in your life. So when I started doing research on that, I ended up deciding to get my own dog to train as service. They call it a service dog prospect when you're getting a dog, considering it to be service, meaning it might work out, it might not work out. It's a huge gamble, essentially. But and I started doing the training with Arrow. For myself, I had to really look at what I needed as an individual in terms of what medical episodes look for me, migraine episodes, panic attack episodes, AFib episodes, what those look like, what certain things I do behaviorally that Arrow can pick up and make and respond to in a way that is actually assisting me and mitigating my disabilities. So I went through all those, those behavioral details that I do, and then would introduce those different things to her, and then require her to do an action based off of those behavioral actions. So just like you teach your dog to sit, they understand the command, the word sit means put your butt to the ground, is the same as when I hyperventilate or cover my face. That signals Arrow to come over, to break my hands apart, to lick my face, to put deep pressure on me to calm me down. For migraines, I took a cotton ball and I put it in my mouth for 10 minutes. And when I was feeling a migraine coming on, that's the key part, and I introduced the scent to her. And it took about a summer of reintroducing this scent and helping her associate that this scent means that she'll progressively like lick my face. So now that she's better at it, it will look like her coming and checking me multiple times a day, and she'll persistently, very focused, will smell my breath. And then, she does it pretty diligently, and then I'll be like, oh, okay, she's checking. And she'll either give me one kiss and walk away and be like, you're good, Mom, or she'll give me like persistent kisses right away, like you need to do something about it. And she's picked up that I need to take medication, so she'll definitely get irritated at me if I don't take it right away, which has been really funny. But and before working on those tasks, as soon as I got Arrow, I got her at 8 weeks old during my time off in college. I started actually with public access training first because I wanted to make sure that she was a dog that could handle being in complicated, very human situations, So, basic obedience and all things that the ADA requires for your dog in terms of behavioral standards. Associating the gear means on duty versus off duty. She's a German Shorthair, which if you aren't familiar with the breed, is a very, very difficult high energy breed. Very intelligent, spunky, needs a lot of stimulation, and was something that attracted me to her and also has been a challenge at the same time. So when she is off duty, she is a typical German Shorthair. She will run for hours, she is loud, she wants to play and jump. On duty, she barely acknowledges people. She's right by my side. She's calm. A lot of people will say, oh my gosh, what kind of dog is that? She's so calm and so sweet. Like, I should get this dog. And I'm like, don't be fooled. She's working, So that's another thing about on and off duty is you really don't know what the dog is like off duty. But I have a lot of friends that their dog is very similarly off duty to they are on duty, which is really funny. So it's really interesting. But anyways, so after I did the public access training and started the task training and Arrow was getting, better at it, I decided to reapply to college. And I went back to college, and Hampshire College is across country, so it was a big move for me. But Arrow came with me and assisted me in all of my classes, and I realized I was able to stay in classes for longer durations of time. Even when panic attacks would start to come on, she would recognize it and try to mitigate the situation, which was really, really nice. But anyways, she made it where I was able to graduate college and be successful, be fully present in my studies. And I also at the time was put on a lot of medication, 3 times the normal dose of what people with my condition typically are on. And it was just really concerning, especially at such a young age. And once Arrow was about a year and I considered her fully trained, which, side note, service dogs are always in training, but when she's fully trained, I was able to reduce my medication by over half. Which at first it was half, and now at this point she's 3 years old and I'm down to maybe like a third of what I used to take before, which is huge for me and really amazing. Granted, medication is also really great and could be an extremely useful and helpful tool, but I'm just thankful that I have something else that can also be helpful for me and provide that extra support that I need where I don't need to take as much medication. So yeah, that's where I'm at now. And I don't know what the next slide is, but yeah, discussion. So one other small thing is that I studied service dog law and policy and invisible disability advocacy. So what I'm doing now with my career is I am mentoring individuals as well as businesses to teach them what their rights are, what the laws are, help them in training employees, as well as creating a game plan for training their own service dog or being in contact with the tools and the individuals they need, trainers, programs, to be able to train their own service dog and get the accommodations that they need. primarily service dogs, but I also do other accommodations as well. Ensure, they're being accommodated in the workplace, and helping, businesses be more accessible to their guests and their employees. So that's primarily what I'm doing now. And I just started building my career, so it's very young, but yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bree, so much for sharing your story and, all the insight about service dogs and terminology, et cetera. And I know that we are at the 4:30 mark, so for anyone that needs to jump off, definitely feel free. We do have this recorded, so we can send this discussion section to you after. But we do have a few questions, not only from us, but from the audience as well. There's been a lot of great conversation on the chat, and people have been chiming in and answering some questions so far, so that's really great. But first and foremost, I know that you mentioned, how you're building your career out of, prepping employers or businesses to make their spaces more accessible to employees that may have service dogs. So how could, what are some actual steps that employers could take to make their business more physically accessible and also like mentally accessible, in a place where you feel safe and people around you feel safe as well?
Yeah, I think in terms of a business thinking about how they can make their general clients, so the general public, more accessible to their space, they could, ensure that they know the laws and that they know their rights and that they really implement them in terms of the ADA. So go beyond making the space accessible, beyond just a wheelchair ramp and a wheelchair button, but really make sure that people that are on the gym, they're not going to direct the rest of everyone else that's in that space, but as well as the gym for the specimen. So that's one thing. Another thing that for their employees is going to try to.
Oh, Bree, I think you're going in and out a bit. It's kind of hard to hear you.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
A little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah, maybe if you just sit closer to the computer. Very
Okay.
good.
I was saying that another way that employers can make employees, with service dogs more comfortable and have a more accessible workspace is same thing, ensure that pets are not being brought in places they're not supposed to be, but also to provide an environment for them where they realistically can be assisted with their dog. If provide them an opportunity to work somewhere where the dog is behind the counter, or somewhere safe, or provide in spaces where the dog absolutely cannot be, which there are limited spaces. There are some spaces where legally they cannot be. They offer other accommodations. And I think just being caring and receptive of the fact that this person relies on a dog for assistance is helpful in itself and appreciated, I think, a lot of companies, what they also could do is in situations where the employee might be going in and out of spaces where the dog is or isn't allowed, providing a kennel that when they go, in the back and somewhere that's a sterile environment, the dog is not allowed to be, they provide a kennel for that time to put their service dog in for when they go in those spaces, and then can get them when they come out on in an area where they are allowed to have that, if that makes sense. So those are some examples.
Thank you. Very good.
Awesome. So kind of going off of that in terms of accessibility in the workplace and work-related topics, what would you say are like the valuable aspects that as someone with a service dog you can bring to the workplace, and what are the things that would be beneficial to a workplace of hiring somebody who does have a service dog as an accommodation?
Yeah, so you can still hear me, right? Okay. So I definitely think, just like anyone with any sort of disability, you know, skills that people with disabilities have naturally had to pick up to survive are positive skills within a work environment. Skills such as adaptability, you know, creativity. An individual with a disability has to advocate for themselves in a lot of cases, be willing to seek help, and in a lot of cases can provide a very unique perspective. I think it's also important that within a work environment, a wide variety of individuals are being represented and included, and that disabled voices are being heard, because they're often muted in our society. So I think that within a workplace, there are a lot of different things that each individual, you know, with a disability or not, can provide. So I definitely think that's something.
Awesome, thank you. So now we have a few questions that were posed in the chat, and then also anyone can, you know, chime in and unmute themselves and ask if you have any questions. But someone asked, for someone like me who knows friends who have invisible disabilities, how can I help that person in a way that I'm not coming on forcefully, but allowing space for this person to talk to me and create conversation?
That's a great question. I think that I feel like if a friend is, I don't really know if they're more open to talking about their disabilities or have shared with you, or haven't. I'm assuming they have shared. I think, you know, just being considerate of the fact that they have other stuff that's going on, even if they aren't sharing it with you, and to just be mindful of how maybe certain behaviors or certain things may come across, may actually be something completely different than what your initial reaction might be. For example, like if your friend is canceling a lot on hanging out with you for like a period of time, it might not be because they're angry at you or have some, you know, they don't want to hang out with you. It could be because they're having, you know, stuff that's going on mentally or physically, emotionally, that is impacting them. And I think in a moment like that, that could be a perfect example of where you kind of chime in and say, hey, like, just wanted to check in and see, you know, what was going on. Even just saying that you're available, you know, being like, hey, like, I want to support you any way I can. In all situations, like, I'm here for you, I see you. You know, I feel like a lot of people with invisible disabilities feel as if they're not seen, and their experiences aren't valid. And just validating that you're there for them and you're willing to listen is everything. You know, it makes a huge difference.
Great. And I believe some of the other ones that were in the chat have been answered, but if anyone feels like they asked a question and it wasn't answered so far, please feel free to chime in. I linked access to the ADA on service dogs. So there's a lot of information in there if you are seeking more information about it. I know someone asked, what's the difference between service dog and service dog in training? Are there legal boundaries for service dog in training, or are they the same? And I know you had mentioned that training is pretty much, you know, never over, but is there that kind of differentiation in terms of legality?
Yeah, so that's also a state-by-state basis where everything stated by the ADA is more of a federal law, our federal laws. But in terms of ESAs, as well as service dogs in training, there are state-by-state regulations in terms of access. There are some states that allow emotional support animals, service dogs in training, to go into places, and there are some states that only allow service dogs and service dogs in training, but not emotional support animals in places. So it's important, if you're curious, you know, to research, of course, everything the ADA says, but also what your state says. because there are definitely, like I said, some states that have regulations and requirements, but people don't really know where to find them, or like hear a lot of misleading and confusing information. So, but majority of the time, I do know majority of states do allow service dogs in training in places that typical service dogs can go, as long as, you know, the handler has control of them at all times and that sort of thing.
Great, thank you. There also is there a specific link where we can review the policies regarding flying and public spaces for service dogs? I'm thinking about an engine that can be specific to find information on this topic.
Yeah, so like I said, the ADA does have, if you go on ada.gov and you search in the little top search box, you can put service dogs, and there's a ton of different links on there to legal, you know, official documents and stuff. And some of them, one of them is most frequently asked questions on service dogs, and that one is extremely helpful. That one tells you more specifics on certain regulations, goes through some more like specific scenarios. In terms of flight or flying is a little bit more complicated in terms of when looking at, you know, where they can or can't go legally, just because, oh gosh, I forget the acronym for it, but they're not entirely under the ADA. They're like partially under the ADA. It's like Flying Associations something, but I can't believe I'm forgetting the acronym for it. But it essentially makes it where service dogs and emotional support animals are always granted access to airports and airplanes, and there's slightly different requirements in terms of bringing your animal through, you know, an airport and on a flight. I do think and have heard that there are some changes that might be happening to that, restricting specifically emotional support animals, comfort animals, to go to beyond planes, but that's also just something I've heard and not yet implicated. So,
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any more questions that they would like to ask us or Bree?
Yes.
Sure, Max.
So what's that dog doing in that picture when that girl graduated from like college or so?
Yeah, so that is a picture of Bree and Arrow when she graduated from Hampshire College.
Interesting.
We got another question. If a person has a service dog and someplace refused to have the team in their place, how or who do they report this to get help?
Yeah, so denied access is definitely a very common issue topic. So in terms of, for example, if Arrow and I go somewhere and we have every right to be there and there's no reason why we should be denied access, I normally, you know, talk with the person, and typically we've gone through some things. You can show them the laws under the ADA, but also there is a number on the ADA that you can call for access issues, and you can have someone speak on your behalf that is an ADA specialist. That is something that I do as well. So some of my clients, for example, in the moment that they're having an access issue and they don't know what to say, and you know, there's a lot of people with disabilities that aren't entirely comfortable with talking to strangers or aren't as verbal, and they need someone else to talk for them, and so they'll call me and I'll talk for them. So that's another thing that you can do, but generally you can report it to the ADA. You actually can also call technically the police. I don't really recommend it, but you can do that, and legally, you know, the place would essentially get in trouble. It would be a violation of the ADA essentially. So it's a pretty big deal, ironically, for how often it does happen. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Are there any final questions?
I think some of the other ones were answered. Rebecca in Rocket is a service dog team friend of mine that answered some questions for me, which is really helpful on there's no breed restrictions for service dogs, despite, the rep of some breeds. Reputation, that's what I was thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I felt talk today. Trying to see if I missed anything else. I think you guys probably saw. Are there dogs for emotional support?
We got another, my team often get requests to provide letters to allow clients that have hidden mental health disabilities. Is there a template or verbiage that is good?
So in terms of service dogs, that wouldn't be eligible or required. It's not required for someone with a service dog to have a letter or any sort of documentation whatsoever. And it's back to that ADA making it really accessible. I personally, as a handler, have found a lot of problematic, aspects to that. I personally would feel it would be much easier if we did have a legitimate legal, registration through the government or something, because it would be easier to go places and not have our access denied, as well as not have fake service dogs everywhere and pets everywhere. But in terms of emotional support animals, which I've mentioned is very, very different from a service dog, they are required to have a doctor's note that says, it's either a doctor's note or a therapist note that says specifically, this person would benefit from having the comfort or companionship of their animal. And an emotional support animal isn't limited to just a dog. It could be any animal. And the ADA doesn't really regulate emotional support animals as much. It just more so, says that service dogs aren't emotional support animals, and emotional support animals aren't service dogs, so they shouldn't be treated as the same. But in that case, in terms of a note, it would be for an emotional support animal.
Great.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions? If not, I have one more. In the note, do they have to give diagnosis?
This is a common, I think, confusion. I'm not honestly 100%. I would have to double check in terms of an ESA. I'm pretty sure that they may need a diagnosis for a medical condition, but I don't entirely know legally if it's required for an ESA specifically. For a service dog, it's not necessarily required, and partially, again, it's the ADA making it as accessible as possible. Not everybody has, the means or the ends or the access to proper healthcare and proper access to a diagnosis. But the ADA does hint to it being highly suggested that you have a diagnosis, a legit, or that you have a disability that meets, these certain definitions under the ADA. In terms of what, Cami, what you're mentioning, it sounds a little bit more in terms of emotional support animals. And I don't know entirely the context of the space in which they're being asked to bring this animal, but if it is emotional support, that would be something that has less access versus a service animal, which in this case should be a landlord. Yeah, so landlord, if it's a landlord, the only access that an emotional support animal has, I do know legally, is within your living space and on an aircraft. So that's the only access that they are granted, and exempt from pet policies. So if a apartment building has a strict pet policy, but your client has a note from their doctor or their therapist saying, you know, like I mentioned, that they benefit from having their emotional support animal that qualifies the animal as emotional support and therefore is allowed to be in that environment. But if it's a service dog, it's a totally different ballgame. That's where it's a little more complicated, and that's partially what I do because it's so complex and almost ironic that you have to provide more information and documentation for an emotional support animal that's not required to be trained whatsoever, but you don't have that for an animal that is required to be highly, highly trained. So it's very ironic and kind of mind-boggling, but that's the reality of it, at least right now.
I think that's where all the confusion comes with the terms.
Absolutely. It's super, super confusing. That's why it would be so much easier for me, like as a service dog handler, if there was some sort, you know, like a driver's test or something where I do go into, a place with a professional that knows, you know, the laws and knows the expectations, and I pass, you know, a public access test with Arrow, and I pass, you know, show that she does all these tasks and all these things and have some sort of thing I must present or whatever. It'd be so much easier, but the reality is that I also understand that the ADA wants to make that a service dog as accessible as possible, but it's just such a, there's so much confusion and frustration amongst all ends. So, but if it's emotional support animal and they do have a doctor's note, no matter what the landlord says, even if it's what's it called? What's the app that you can Airbnb? There you go. Even if it's Airbnb, the land and they have a note and it's an emotional support animal, they have to allow it, and they have to provide that documentation. Now, if it's an Airbnb, say I'm going to stay at an Airbnb with Arrow and they have a strong pet policy, I don't even legally have to tell them I have Arrow. Just like a person with a wheelchair wouldn't have, or a person with medication or a hearing aid or any other medical device would have to say, I have this, like, just so you know what I mean? Like, that's any question that you have in terms of if a service dog can or can't do this. Like I said, think of it as any other sort of medical device, and that's a great way to answer those sorts of questions. Especially if you get confused on the differences.
Wonderful, thank you. And then just closing us out here, what do you hope that people will take away from this conversation today? Like any, takeaways or key aha moments that, if anything is remembered after this, what you want them to internalize?
I think that the biggest things, well, first off, the biggest thing is that it's never okay to do service dog fraud, to fake a pet as a service dog. And this includes registering or certifying via online or even through a credible trainer. If they say, oh, you have a registered certified service dog, that is incorrect information, that is illegal, and has legal consequences. So I think that's the biggest thing, is to not do service dog fraud and to not bring pets into places that they aren't allowed, to respect pet policies. That's, I think, one of them for sure. I think that another thing is to think about invisible disabilities and how they are a lot more common than people think. That there are a lot more individuals with disabilities than we may even realize. 1 in 4 people, 61 million at least. So you don't really know what's going on with someone, to not judge a book by its cover, and a team by how they seem. So, but more so by how the dog behaves and how the handler responds to the dog. That's your biggest thing. I just hope that people, think a little bit more about accessibility in terms of of space, public spaces, but also within the workforce and employers thinking about their employees, and to not discriminate or fear, having an employee that has a medical tool, any medical tool, as a service, including a service dog, as a hindrance to them, but it actually has a lot of benefits. There could be a lot of positive, impact that having an individual with a disability on your team or as your employee could bring. So to diversify and challenge, social stigmas.
Definitely. And that reminds me of how you actually have the fact that you trained Arrow on your resume as an achievement, which I think is so cool, because it is truly a massive achievement. And it's something that, as Best Buddies jobs as well, when we work with our participants, we are listing out skills and different, things that they have learned throughout life that would be applicable to a job, like as you said, being adaptable, being creative, the willpower, the resilience. So
Strength.
definitely.
And the diversity, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone. If there are no more questions, then just so you know, this is information about how to stay in touch with us. You see my email is up there, so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I believe that I did the whole recording of this correctly, so fingers crossed that that'll get sent out after this. And then also just threw up Arrow's Instagram. Please do follow her and Bree, and you can stay informed about everything that it is that we spoke about today, and also Bree's LinkedIn. Is there anything else, Bree, that you want to share about what you do on your Instagram or anything like that?
Yeah, it's just a platform I use to publicly, share about everyday life with a service dog and some invisible disability and service dog awareness, and as well as cute dog photos, of course. But
that reminds me, I forgot to say that September is Service Dog Awareness Month. So, yay! So thank you for joining us to celebrate that.
So yeah, feel free to questions if you're curious about how to get in touch with me on, professionally, if you need support, mentoring, guidance for training, employees, getting your own service dog, any questions like that at all, please feel free to message me.
Yeah.
And yes, Samantha's email is samanthagarrick@bestbuddies.org. And then Bree's Instagram, well, it's Arrow's Instagram, run by Bree, is @followyourarrow_GSP.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining. And yeah, I hope you learned some cool new facts today. I definitely have learned so much just through, speaking with Bree. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Bree.
Bye.